Hi, I'm David Petersen, the creator of Mouseguard, and welcome to Creator Commentary for the third series of Mouseguard, The Black Axe. This episode will cover Issue 1, or Chapter 1, when it was collected into a hardcover edition. Please feel free to follow along in your copy of the story either in issue form or from the hardcover, as I talk about the behind-the-scenes details, art notes, and my headspace as I go page by page and panel by panel. Also, a fair warning, there will be lots of spoilers if you have not yet read this volume or the rest of the Mouseguard series. Back when starting the winter volume, I laid out my plan for several more Mouseguard books, and the order in which I'd make them. Black Axe was always planned to be my third volume, focusing on Kellenaw in his prime as the Black Axe. To my memory, the earliest plan was doing it as a shorter book, something like 4 issues, while also being a more light-hearted, pure adventure story. Each issue a different short tale, perhaps set in a very different location. Kellenaw and his friend Conrad battling beasts on sand and sea, city and wilderness. But in digging up reference material for this commentary, I found 2 documents, both created in March of 2007, when I was in the early stages of the winter book, that have very different synopsis for the book as a whole. In one, young Kellenaw falls under the tutelage of Conrad's father, who was secretly the Black Axe of that time. An even younger Conrad becomes incensed, believing it was he who should be the next Black Axe. There was also a suggestion of tying Sadie's father into the tale as a boat builder. In the other, Kellenaw on patrol meets with a common mouse and his son. The father is a drunkard and harsh on the boy, but also drops hints that he is the Black Axe. After an unfortunate accident, the father dies, and Kellenaw not only finds hidden in his possessions the Black Axe itself, but also proof that the mouse was not in fact the Black Axe, but the murderer of the last true wielder of it. Kellenaw then raises the boy, named Conrad, and they have adventures, which lead to an impossible Gwen Stacy-type choice of saving Conrad or saving a town of mice, and Kellenaw chooses the greater good, which costs Conrad his leg. While there are common themes in these with the published book, they are very different stories than what I eventually wrote and drew as the Black Axe. As I've said, after killing Kellenaw off in the winter book, my plan was always to follow that up with a young Kellenaw tale. But it became a quest story. Kellenaw doesn't end up holding the axe until halfway through the book. In the pages of the winter book in the ice cave, Kellenaw promises Liam to tell him the story of the day his paw first touched the axe. Unfortunately for Liam, Kellenaw died before Kellenaw could share it with him directly. But this was my way of giving that tale to the fans, and ultimately to Liam too. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The final outline for this issue is dated as being created in April of 2010, and I recall being hard-pressed to figure out what the audience entry point for this story was. So I took my digital camera to a nature park and photographed bits of trees and rocks and interesting mushrooms, hoping that I could just visualize a narrative by the time I sat down to outline the issue. Cover. This cover, I think, is the weakest of the Black Axe series. Perhaps that was because I drew it almost 5 months before starting work on the outline, or drawing page 1. I only know that now because of the dates of the files for my scanned pencils. I have no idea why there is so much of a time gap between them, but it means that I was guessing at visuals for what would be a pivotal point of issue 1. The front cover features Em and her crow on the frostic beach, Em clutching a book with an image of the Black Axe weapon on its cover, while a hiding Kellenaw draws his sword. I'll talk more about Kellenaw's sword and Em's book further into the issue. On the back side, the frostic outpost is in the process of being built. More on that later too. Kellenaw, his birch tree cover, and the beach grass all have black outlines, but the rest of the drawing utilizes a color hold, where I've painted the ink work as a color other than black to help push the depth and distance. In this book, I knew I wanted to up my game for illustrations that evoked epic cinematic visuals. Inside front cover. I kept up my tradition of using the inside front cover like the opening crawl of Star Wars, as in previous volumes. But this time, I wanted not to refresh the audience as to what happened last issue, but instead to give an illuminated manuscript page, like the ones based on the Book of Kells from Fall. These wouldn't be talking directly about any current story, or Kellenaw specifically, but would be thematically tied in with the mood of each issue. For issue 1, the text just simply needed to set up the idea of the Black Axe as a legend. All of the type I did using a font in Photoshop, but then I printed out that text and hand-inked it onto a sheet of Bristol using a lightbox, along with all the Celtic-inspired knotwork. This way I could distress the image and lettering with ink to look like old manuscript rather than fresh digital pixels. Page 1, Panel 1. An establishing shot of the Frostic shore. Frostic is the outpost where Sadie is mentioned, having kept watch prior to the events of the Fall book, and here we see a version of it in the spring of 1116 in the process of being built. Starting the book in the spring season, as well as the prologue story in the hardcover spring 1153, was a nod to the fans who asked after the fall and winter books when the spring volume would come out. I don't know that I'll ever title another Mouseguard series with a season and date combo again. It encourages too many requests for the next book in the calendar order, and I don't like the idea that every moment of every season of these characters' lives is worth chronicling. Just like real life, big events happen that are story-worthy, and then a lull of everyday life. Panels 2 through 4. As for Frostic Outpost's visual origins, I based it on a covered balcony section of the children's playhouse building at Bolt Castle in the Thousand Islands. The first time I'd drawn this building, it was where Sadie is standing atop the roof slinging stones to ward off seagulls. This image was in one of my first color sketchbooks and also included in the fall softcover. And again, I drew it in the background of a convention poster of Lucas riding a duck away from Frostic in a lightning storm. In panel 2, Kellinaw is shown to be the builder of the new outpost. Kellinaw, having some experience as a mason, ties in later with his father being the stonemason at Lockhaven in the Free Comic Book Day story, Piper the Listener. The Pinecone Raft in panels 3 and 4 are a callback to Midnight and his army using them in fall. I like the idea that there are some boats that are crafted for long-term use, but guard mice are more prone to use whatever's on hand to ford waterways. Kellinaw's cloak color is not dark like in the previous volumes. This was a visual differentiation to make young Kellinaw not the same mouse as who we see him as in fall and winter. More on Kellinaw's cloak in Chapter 5. Page 2, Panel 1. The outline has this M scene take place before what we saw on page 1, but I think I changed it to be page 2 because I didn't like opening the book about Kellinaw's time with the axe on another mouse. M of Appleloft is mentioned in a poem in Winter by Roybin about secrets. I don't know if the secret Roybin is referring to in his ballad is that M is connected to the Black Axe, the fate of her brother Ben, what she doesn't share with Kellinaw about the Ferrer bloodline and its connection to the axe. Who knows? Even as the author, I feel some things are better left unexplained. I did a fair amount of research to see what a medieval loom might look like. More on the furnishings in panel 3. Panel 2. One of those panels where I show an object instead of a character. It's an almost illegible Ferrer family tree, something I had to generate early on, even though we only get snippets of the chart in this issue and the next, and we don't get a decent look at all the names until the hardcover extras. Like the inside front cover, I made a digital version of the chart, and then would print it out, sometimes distorted in perspective like here, so that I could hand ink the type on the art page. My rule for hand lettering is that if it's something the mice could see or read, I ink it by hand. If it's heard, like dialogue or a sound effect, I digitally letter it with a font. The names circled at the bottom are Kellinaw and M, distant cousins, but the last in each of their lines. Panel 3. Before drawing this page, I drew a floor plan of M's entire apartment and listed all the items I wanted her to have to instill her character, who is somewhat based on Jeremy Bastian's wife, Emily. Those items include a loom, a desk, books, skulls, tack for riding birds, candles, feathers, a nest as a bed, and insect taxidermy. There is also a spinning wheel, a bird's egg, and a seashell in M's collection. The window pattern is based on a locket design I saw online and saved in an inspiration folder on my hard drive. Panel 4 is a nature panel to establish her crow and the scale of the mice to the world. The porch balcony of M's place also acts as a dock and landing pad for the birds she befriends and rides. Appleloft isn't a city where the living spaces are all enclosed in a single massive structure, but instead it's a series of unconnected mouse dwellings in the various apple trees of an entire orchard grove. Page 3, Panel 1. As Kellenaw mentioned earlier, the Frostic outpost he was looking to upgrade was little more than a hole in the ground. Kellenaw is pulling back a basket-woven panel that acts as a door. I assume it also gets buried in sand drifts when the outpost is vacant, but prevents the living quarters from being filled in. In the narration, Kellenaw mentions solitude. This is a major theme for this volume, and Kellenaw is a character. Even when he wants companionship, he's ultimately alone. Panel 2. The interior of the current Frostic is an echo of Kellenaw's reclusive home we see in Fall Chapter 4 with the hammock. The chest is meant to be the same one we see Liam pawing through, full of Kellenaw's old stuff in the winter epilogue. I think the color choice of Kellenaw's cloak was based on that same winter panel, from a bit of a pale blue cloth sticking up out of that trunk. In my rough pencils for this panel, I had tick marks carved into the vertical wooden beams, a way to show Kellenaw counting his days and tracking time. I think I didn't ink it in because I knew it would get lost in the darker lighting scene I had planned for this panel with the lighting of the pipe. The ceiling having tangles of grass roots is also an echo to the organic vine-like woodwork in Kellenaw's home in Fall 1152. And Kellenaw's line about a guard mouse who trained Tenderpaws in survival was a way for me to quickly convey to the audience that Kellenaw was a master at this skill, without having to show lots of examples of it. Wilderness survival skills are important for any guard mouse, but for a mouse with the theme of solitude, I thought explaining he's such a master of it, he teaches it, would inform his character to the audience. Panel 3. A change in camera angle. I pulled back for scale as Kellenaw mentions an idea of the guard I always worry isn't conveyed to the audience, that the guard don't live at Lockhaven much at all. They spend more time out of doors than within. Panel 4. To vary the size of the figure in each panel as well as the camera angle, this last panel needed to be a close-up of Kellenaw with his pipe lit. As I've done with smoke in Mouseguard in the past, Kellenaw's pipe smoke is made up of my thumb and fingerprints inked directly onto the page with a color hold applied to them during the digital coloring stage. In the narration, Kellenaw mentions listening for predators, something that comes up in a few pages. Page 4, Panel 1. As Kellenaw pulls on and buckles his belt, complete with the pouch and small tinderbox we saw in winter, we get a better look at that sword. The Claymore hilt design echoes back to the sword Kellenaw used in Fall, though it can't possibly be the same one since A, it's drawn differently, more angular, and B, it would be very odd for the sword of young Kellenaw to eventually end up in Kenzie's possession almost 40 years later, only for Kenzie to bury it and then give it back to Kellenaw. The sword's scabbard is meant to be of snake scale, my way to show how accomplished Kellenaw is at the dispatching of beasts. The text just reestablishes Lockhaven to the reader and gives them something familiar to grab onto. Panel 2. A flashback panel of Lucas's induction into the Guard. To get that flashback look, I applied a digital color layer over the entire panel to lighten it up. Lucas has been established in a winter flashback training Saxon, and I'd drawn him for a few commissions and sketchbook pieces by the time I was working on this issue. His tunic is plaid, to pay homage to that red flannel George Lucas was always so fond of wearing. This means that the mentor of Saxon's mentor was Kellenaw. In my original outline, it was to be Lucas and Odell, who Sharp-Eyed RPG players will recognize as the name of Kenzie's mentor, coming to take over for Kellenaw. But I thought having Lucas and Odell be partners like Saxon and Kenzie was a little too echoey in a bad way, so only Lucas is coming to Frostic. I'd drawn an induction scene as a sketchbook piece and also as a spot illustration for the role-playing game, but this is the first, and so far only, time I've depicted it in the pages of a story. Presiding over the ceremony is the matriarch Bronwyn, who we don't hear named until later on in this issue, and then shown later in the volume. I've also paid homage to her with one of my limited prints titled Elderberry. As some of you may know, Julia and I have a dog named Bronwyn, but the character came first, Actually, we first became aware of the name at a signing when a fan with that name asked me to personalize her book for her. Julia and I both liked the name, and I jotted it down as a very Mouseguard appropriate name. And I eventually used it here for a matriarch. When Julia and I later got our dog as a puppy, we also named her Bronwyn. Panel 3. A full landscape panel for scale, but also to establish that the beach transitions from sand to grassy plain up to a thick grouping of birch trees. Kellinaw is drawn in there as a two-eared dot, but he gets lost in the color hold, I think. The text of this panel is trying to correct a common misconception I found fans having, that guard mice would seek out the slaying of beasts. They try not to, if possible, with the exception of a few bloodthirsty mouse characters. Here Kellinaw emphasizes another dangerous condition, mating season, where guard mice would avoid conflict with them at all costs. Page 5, Panel 1. Switching camera angle and scale again, just to transition Kellinaw from beach up to the birch trees, so that he's not visible to Em when she lands on the sand. After all, that's how I'd already drawn it for the cover, and I needed to match that staging. Panels 2 and 3. Em arrives by crow as Kellinaw hides, which is also exactly the only words in my outline for this and the next page's scene. Panel 3 is an example of a panel close to recreating the cover moment, but with a slightly different angle and timing. Page 6, Panel 1. To show that this crow wasn't just a random bird to Em, I decided to have it rigged with some rope reins and a strapped pouch. Clearly Em has a history and relationship with this bird. Em withdraws her book from the pouch while gently standing on the crow's leg. In Panel 2, Kellinaw calls the crow her scavenging mount. This is a bird that some mice, even guard mice, could consider a predator or as a threat, but not Kellinaw. Panel 3. For most of these crow panels, I used a lot of photo reference and stockpiled a file folder full of images of crows from different angles, flying, standing, eating, cawing. But I also had to figure out a way to draw and ink the crow to not look quite so referenced, so that it blended in with the rest of my artwork. The narration, in her day, is meant to reinforce that Em is not a young fur. She is described on page 2 as aged, though I think I struggled to depict that visually as well as I would have liked to in the series. Page 7, Panel 1. Good grief, grass texture, David. I was trying to show a lot of open nature behind Kellinaw to imply that the larger beasts could be anywhere, and that the scale of the world to a mouse makes that prospect terrifying. I don't know how well this panel actually pulls that off, though. Panel 2. The slow reveal takes a beat on this page to show emerging silhouettes of the predators, and unlike any predators we've seen active in a Mouseguard story before, they are clearly wielding weapons. Panel 3. The Fishers. Fishers are part of the weasel family, but don't think of them as the size of a ferret or a least weasel. They are much, much bigger. Adults can grow to be 3 to 4 feet long. Terrifying, right? And to up the scary for the story, I clothed them in the bones and pelts of their victims. I wanted the first reaction for an audience to be that these are vicious, brutal savages of the animal world, in stark contrast to the mice, and even to the few images I've shown of the weasels of Darkheather up to this point. In real life, fishers tend to be solitary hunters, but associate with other fishers for mating. So I added that mating bit to the narration to justify there being a pack of 4 of these beasts. Which are the males and which are the females? I tend to see the one with the skull mask and the one with the crab shell breastplate as the females, and the other 2 as the males. I'll talk more about their clothing in a few pages. Page 8, Panel 1. Not aware of the danger, Em unknowingly calls out for the mouse she's tracked down. Panel 2. And using a smaller font size, I try to imply Kellinaw using a hushed voice to quiet Em. Panel 3. I think I like this crow panel just as a beat. There's no real story reason. But I think by adding the panel, I've implied that the crow is having some reaction to Kellinaw's shush. Panel 4. Em mispronouncing Kellinaw's name here. I did that on purpose because even after I thought I'd made it clear how to pronounce his name in the Winter Book, fans would still ask me questions about the mouse named Salanaway. As Em has never met her distant kin, and she's only ever read the name on paper, I had her make the mistake so many fans were making. And Kellenaw's narration backs up that the name is uncommon, old, and hard to pronounce. Page 9. I had Kellenaw correct her pronunciation, but pretend not to be named that, and it's for an odd reason that I'll get into when discussing the next page. In panel 2, we get a better look at M's book, which is going to become less tall and more square as the volume goes on, as her book is meant to symbolize the very book we are reading. If you're looking at the hardcover copy of the book, take off the dust jacket and look at the cover. Page 10, panel 1. The lead and follow narration here connects back to Kellenaw walking away from M on the last page. But there I didn't think the visual of him worked unless I also had him saying follow. Kellenaw wants off that beach. M's hand is a subtle signal cue to her crow for it to stay. And M reveals that she knows that he is Kellenaw. So why the ruse on his identity? Panels 2 and 3. Because I needed a way in the dialogue for M to necessitate reciting the son of, daughter of, son of lineage. It's not only important to signal to Kellenaw that she's right and that she's truthful, but also to convey that to the reader. Kellenaw confirms it. The connection is one of blood and ancestry. Of note of what we can see on this branch of the family tree, Kellenaw had an older sister named Rosalie, and that is brought up later in this volume, as well as in the Free Comic Book Day story, Piper the Listener. The male names on the chart are bracketed, and the females are surrounded by parentheses, meaning that Kellenaw's bloodline connection to the Farrer family tree is through his mother, Marin. Panel 4. Here, M details that she made a stop between when we saw her on page 2 at Appleloft and now. She's been to Lockhaven, but she gets cut off before we understand why that is significant. And Kellenaw is cut off by the first sounds of the cawing of the crow. Page 11, panel 1. Since we know from later in the issue that M can understand the language of birds, her reactions in each panel with cawing are more distressed than the next. As she reacts here, she is dropping her book, and we see falling out of it are the family tree as well as a wax-sealed letter. More on that letter by the end of the issue. Panel 2. And M's crow is cawing up a storm. I use several different but similar enough fonts to try and visually capture the call of a crow in distress. Note the rope around the crow's neck is being pulled taut here. In a page turn, I reveal why. Panel 3. But before that, I take a beat for more reaction from M, as well as Kellenaw setting up the reader to wonder why the crow hasn't simply flown off. Page 12. The cruel splash page for those 4 massive fissures having pinned down the crow, using the very ropes M used to ride it. It was important for me for this not only to be a splash page, but an anticipation moment. Nothing has happened to the crow yet. I made sure not to put any tooth, claw, or blade touching the bird. This is so I could cut around showing those moments on the next page and not be too graphic. Page 13. Fans have told me how much they reacted to these pages and this scene. And what's interesting is how they would tell me how surprised at the violence and gore I drew for this scene. Because I didn't directly draw any of either. We only see tiny snippets of the action, and in almost every panel we only see the fissures with loose feathers, and only tiny dot indications of blood. I opted to cut around the horror of what was happening, and instead focus on the reaction shots of the crow and a much larger panel close up to M's eye welling up with tears. It's a Hitchcock trick of not showing the event, but showing the witness's reaction to it, to get more emotion from the viewer. What was in the reader's mind is more visceral and compelling than anything I could draw. I'm very proud of how many fans have said that this scene brings them to tears. It should be a goal of storytellers to elicit an emotional reaction from their readers, and while I don't take pleasure in making people cry, I am happy that this scene worked as intended to move the audience. For M's tear, I inked the outline right on the page, and then used a color hold in the digital coloring stage to make it nearly white. I think Kellenaw's narration also plays into the tragedy and horror of this scene. M could understand every word that crow said, and Kellenaw claims it blamed M for its death. That narration is also to cement that While in the Winter book Kellanau could speak to other beasts, here in 1116 he does not yet have that skill. Page 14, Panel 1. I chose to make the mice small in this panel to emphasize their vulnerability, and to leave more open distance in front of them for the same reason. Only a few blades of grass between them and the murderous fishers. Panel 2. This pullback nature shot is based on a photo I took of one of my childhood camping haunts, the tree-covered bluffs in Buttersville Park, just south of Ludington, overlooking Lake Michigan. Every bit of line work in this panel is a color hold, to subtly paint it between bits of yellow, green, and brown so dark it's almost black. The mice are also black inks on the original page, and color held here to be slightly painted with the hints of M and Kellanau's colors. While M questions Kellanau's bravery as a guard mouse, he responds with a line I love, but I'd wish I'd written to be, I'd rather fight one of anything before taking on a pack of even the smallest beast. Panel 3. To make the panel more interesting, I tried to scale the three fishers to be shown at different depths away from the viewer, and the female with the bone mask, who was my favorite to draw, got the close-up. Page 15. This sequence was very much Lord of the Rings inspired. Panel 1. The tree in this panel is based on a real tree in that same camping location from the last page. The sandy soil has shifted and eroded to expose massive portions of the oak's root structure. I'd been fascinated by these trees since I was a kid. There's more than one of them like this up there. I also included a drawing of one in the Mouseguard RPG as a spot illustration to inspire setting ideas. M and Kellanau heading down a route into the hollow are almost in view of the fisher. I wanted this to feel tense. The background sky in the next several pages has an odd technique I tried, where I'd cross-hatch little patches on the original art page, and then color hold them in this coloring stage to be lighter than the background color. I was trying to evoke the feeling of bits of skylight peeking through a canopy of trees. Panel 2. Like the ring wraith leaning over the hiding spot of the four hobbits in the Fellowship of the Ring, the skull-masked fisher gets ever closer to finding our mouse heroes. Panels 3 and 4. My hope as a graphic storyteller is that the reader can almost hear these two panels. The fisher sniffing out its prey, and the dead drip of the crow blood hitting that exposed root. Panel 5. Almost a repeat of Panel 2, but drawn without the fisher, as Kellanau and M leave their hiding spot. While we aren't done talking about the fishers yet, I wanted to make note that for this third volume, I wanted to open with a creature attack, like the snake in fall or the owl in winter. But unlike those, the predators are never attacked or dispatched by the mice in the whole series, and the mice earn their safety from hiding and running. Avoidance was a technique that the characters had done in the previous volumes, but ultimately was only used as a delay tactic before a combat. And I thought to have a mouse never attack the predator was an interesting and counterintuitive choice for the mouse to be the Black Axe. Though with Kellanau's line in Winter for Saxon to not seek conflict but seek resolution, perhaps it fits him perfectly. Page 16. I had an alternative sequence for the mice avoiding the fishers sketched out where they utilized tree fungus growing off of the sides of a tree trunk as stairsteps, which echoed back to when we first met Kellanau in Chapter 4 of Fall, but I scrapped it for this version. Panel 1. Let's first make note of the snail. I'd drawn snails in an Abominable Charles Christopher guest strip for Carl Kerschel about a year before this page, and I'd realized I'd never drawn a snail in Mouseguard, so I added one here. The fishers have cornered an animal, but I've only given a subtle silhouette of a different species of armed rodent. Panels 2 and 3. The other animal was a squirrel. Another first for Mouseguard. I've been asked before about my lack of other common mammal species in my books, like squirrels or chipmunks, and my only real answer was that I wanted to focus on mice and avoid further comparisons with Redwall. But here, I thought it would be okay to show that there are other cultures of rodents who wear types of clothing. The squirrel is wearing some kind of leg wraps and a rope bracelet. I'd elaborate on this idea and try to retcon an implication as to why there may not be more of those species within the mouse territories on a cover from Legends of the Guard Volume 3, about the 892 battle of the Maple War between squirrels and chipmunks. Page 17, panels 1 through 3. With the narration, these hunters wore their determination for prey as adornment, I wanted to talk about the clothing visuals for the fishers. The one with the crab shell breastplate with multiple dangling crab claws also has a weasel pelt stole attached to the shell at the paws that also runs over the shoulders and down the back. She has a crown of woven bones decorated with beads. In the middle is the male with the scars. He has a sash made of a patchwork of pelts. Some appear to be scraps, while others are clearly mouse. On his shoulders are bird skull pauldrons, held together with a string of animal teeth. His sword is adorned with animal bones and teeth, as the guard and pommel. Even the savage-looking blade is made of carved bone as well. On the right is the female with the bone skull helm, with 6 gutted fish dangling as decoration. She has a bit of cloth covering her lower half, but on her wrist is a bracer made of a rib cage. You can see this more clearly a few pages back. And her weapon is a nasty-looking spear that also appears to have bone shards as barbs. I'll talk about the remaining fisher on the next page. Panel 4. This panel is almost exactly the framing as the panel at the top of the last page, but with the camera having dollied to the right a bit. And we can see that a bit of time has passed, judging on how the snail has moved. And why does M stop here? Is she listening to the last words from the squirrel? I think I just wanted her to be passing the threshold in the hero's journey terms. She's seeing the horror of life outside of her friendly birds and apple loft. Kellinaw leads them to an ivy-covered burrow or hidey hole, so they're less visible on their way to the water. I think at one point I was going to use a hollow log, but I went for this hole instead. Page 18, panel 1. And in my thumbnails, I see reference to the start of this page being a map, with some kind of view of markers showing the path Kellinaw and M used underground to come up to the shoreline. But I realized I could just show them at the shore, and the reader could fill in the blanks in their head. In the research I did about fishers while working on this issue, I saw something about their etymology saying, despite the name fisher, the animal is not known to eat fish. I somehow misremembered that and translated it into this narration that they don't like deep water. Panel 2. Back to Kellinaw using materials on hand, and how that may not always work ideally for guard mice when boat making. I tried to show that this leaf and the others around were dried and decaying with holes. It is spring after all, so these have been on the ground since last fall, with a winter time of snow on top of them before the thaw. I also wanted a nature challenge that M would have the solution for, rather than our survival expert, Kellinaw. Panel 3. In the narration, Kellinaw uses a gender-neutral its. I did that because I wanted him to still be a typical guard mouse at this point in the story, very mouse-centric. It's not until he encounters more animals and starts to learn their language that he would take the time to identify them, or understand them as quote-unquote people. This fisher, a male, has a porcupine pelt cape, and while his headdress is cloth and sporting only a lone feather, the rapier has a bone guard and a tooth pommel like the other male's sword. Panels 4 and 5. M to the rescue with her training in bird language. Just like Kellinaw's hoot hoot to the owl in winter, M's quack quack and the reply from the duck evidently says a lot more than what we read in those words. I try to use a different font for every animal's language, something I'll speak more on in Chapter 3. The inclusion of a duck in the pages of Mouseguard was also about paying homage to the animal characters from my high school idea called 1149, which is what Mouseguard grew out of. Page 19, panel 1. I'm not sure why I opted to silhouette the fishers in this panel, other than to establish that there was distance between them and the mice, and perhaps also to distinguish them from any drawing that I would do again on panel 3. Panel 2. The line showing Kellinaw's leaping trajectory was inked black on the page, but color held in the digital coloring stage to be white. Panel 3. Emily Bastian, Jeremy's wife, was raising ducks at the time I was working on this issue, so she invited me out to their place, and she let me take lots of reference photos, many of which were with her encouraging the duck to flap her wings. Kellinaw is just barely hanging onto a feather here as the spear misses them and the duck takes off.
Page 20, Panel 1. The tiny dots on the back of the duck are meant to be M and Kellinaw, and the 4 tiny dots on the shore in Panel 2 are showing the fissures left behind. Far enough into the open water, the duck lands. Emily helped me with a photo for this duck pose too. Panel 3. As M keeps watch, Kellinaw starts to speak. I wanted his dialogue to have a substantive pause before he finishes his thought on the next page, and in my mind, the pacing is that of the soldier in the 1939 Wizard of Oz. She's dead. You killed her. The same amazed unbelief in that delivery as to what Kellinaw experiences on page 21. This is the first time I've gotten to say it for this chapter. This page is a 180-degree rotation of the facing page's layout. Panel 1. Kellinaw asks about speaking to beasts without fur, something that the Piper Free Comic Book Day story tells us he's wanted to do since he was a child to avoid loneliness. And off-panel, M explains her experience with both the difficulty and the simplicity in learning other tongues. Panel 2. Here the gender pronouns come up again, only pointing out that M has taken the time to treat the duck as an equal to know what gender she is. The color-held swimming duck feet were something I did to help break up the large amounts of flat, calm water on these pages, a visual to add some subtle interest. Panel 3. In general, I tried to avoid crisscrossing balloons, unless they are meant to symbolize one conversationalist cutting off the other. Illustratively, you tend to help yourself by drawing the first character to speak on the left side of the panel to avoid this problem. But I wanted the duck facing right. Subconsciously, as a visual, we all read going into a journey away from home as moving to the right of the panel, page, or screen, which is why from here on out, I have the full body panels of the duck facing only to the right. This adventure is about to begin. Kellinaw doesn't yet understand the quest, though. He's in guard mouse mode, wanting to report the presence of the fishers on the shore to the other guard mice and Lockhaven. Page 22, Panel 1. Now M is able to finish telling why she stopped at Lockhaven, and probably how she knew exactly where to find Kellinaw at Frostick. Panel 2. Kellinaw holds the wax-sealed envelope. Proof this is from Bronwyn, and has not been tampered with. His eye is a simple dot. Since I don't give the mice a lot of cartoonish features to show emotion with, I have to rely a lot on body language and eye shape. This wide eye, I think, conveys his shock at seeing that seal. Panel 3. To get this letter typesetting correct, I printed out a typed font and then folded the paper as seen here, and photographed myself holding it. I scaled the photo to fit in the panel in Photoshop, and then on a light box, I inked the panel and added enough character in the inking to make it look appropriate as something the mice are able to read and not a computer-generated lettering applied afterwards. I'll go into the specific wording of this letter in a later commentary for Chapter 5. Panel 4. The "As You Wish" line is both an homage to the Princess Bride, a reference I used to help define the idea that the Black Axe is not just one mouse, but a role many have played throughout history, a la the Dread Pirate Roberts, but also to echo the panel and dialogue from Fall, when Kellinaw instantly obeys the word of Gwendolyn and kneels before her. Page 23, Panel 1. The ties to this journey being about family and blood are established, as is the destination. But I haven't quite impressed on the reader yet how uncommon a trek across the sea is. I correct that in the first few pages of Chapter 2. The bloodline bit of this story is something that is cliché for these legendary quest stories, that you have to have some kind of lineage to be special. And while I wanted to pay homage to that trope, I also wanted to turn it on its head a bit. More on that when we get to the commentary for Chapter 6. Panel 2. A quick small panel for a beat of acknowledgement or hesitation from Kellinaw, as in Panel 3, he rises to his hind paws and relates his plan to get them across the sea, and into Chapter 2 of this volume. Panel 4. And in the last panel of the issue, the quest object, as well as the title of this book, is revealed with a close-up visual on M's book. Pinup by Alex Scheichman. Alex and I met early on in Mouseguard's publication when Archaea founder Mark Smiley took Archaea from being a publishing house for just his book, Artesia, to a creator-owned publishing house that would take on more titles by other talent. Alex's book Robotica was one of the first books signed into that first class of books, as was Mouseguard. We enjoyed each other's company at convention signings and events, and enjoyed each other's artwork. I'd done a pinup for Alex's second volume of Robotica on the condition that he would do a pinup for Mouseguard at some point. Alex asked me to do the colors for it, and even though I felt like I'd leveled up a lot since my early Mouseguard color work on Fall, this piece did throw me, because in black and white, it's all about negative space. I did my best to not ruin it, but looking back now, I know I'd handle the owl differently for certain. The armor design of Alex's piece makes me think he was inspired by Mark Smiley's pinup from issue 4 of Fall. Alex was also a contributor to Legends of the Guard Volume 1 with his story, Oleg the Wise. And that's the first issue of Mouseguard the Black Axe. It has been collected in a hardcover published by Archaea. If you've enjoyed this commentary, please leave comments in the section below, let me know what I didn't answer for you in this issue, and subscribe for updates when I add more Mouseguard commentary. Thank you for listening.